Perfect. All
Mhm.
right. I guess the one thing any of us that have been in forages for a long time know, it is a humbling profession to be in where you're continually learning. And I think some of you on this call have more learning even than I do. With that in mind, I'll try to share pieces I think that uh, are the way I kind of see things. And I hope that'll be useful to you. And in doing so, hopefully put things a little more together. In a way in which we'll get a little more of principles and build into a recipe, I think is the way I'd look at it. And now there we go. Um, there's no doubt when we start looking at a livestock industry, so often in ruminants and such, the idea that this is in fact something that strongly involves being out on the landscape and animals that are living in fresh air and sunshine and such. But if we're out on forages, then that part of a background is how do we manage forages for the best they can be? And my take home here, so if anybody wants to leave after we're through, is that I'm amazed at what kind of a crop of value forages can be. And that is above and below ground. When we're looking at it, we have to look at the weed side, the herbicide residual side, because so often we forget that if we're taking land back or if it's had crops put on it, it could have residues that any forage plants we plant could be damaged or just some. So my comment there is do the soils work, do the soil test, address the needs of the plants before you start. The species side, we'll walk through that and looking at what alternatives we've got and which we maybe are surprised have been added to the list. Seed bed, this is crucial. Everything comes back down to success or failure almost based on seed bed preparation before, not during, not after, but before seeding. And the seeding of a cover crop, bad or good, let's have a look at that and the opportunities to manage it for cash flow or for use in a manner that's going to be productive and profitable over the term. Monitoring, controlling for success. And I think the big thing there is I look at dollars down the road, I look at dollars in the present when I'm doing that, because the idea of that whole game is to make sure that you are in business, and business means making enough profit to make a living from the farm and to value it and manage it accordingly. And the last part I always look at is the management side to get what you want, because it's surprising and you have means of doing that more than we think. So let's look and explore a little bit of this. Forages for many people is, as one person put it to me, it's a crapshoot. And we don't want it to be. It doesn't have to be. And how can we take control of that back? That's what we're going to try to do tonight. And I sure hope that vehicle he's got, he didn't pay too much for. But the idea behind it, making things easier to do it right in a way in which we'll follow some principles. The first thing I look at when I'm doing my herbicide residual, as I said to you, do that based on asking somebody or looking back at your records. Thereafter, I do the soil test and I start looking at it from a standpoint of what fertility would I look to add to a stand and realizing how it can play into the game. And nitrogen, of course, it makes things grow. And in very little growth occurs in the start of a new stand's life, but the cover crop also. And as we go further down the way, we want to not be growing the weeds too well either. Phosphorus is really crucial. Seedling size, if it's deficient, could be 4 times smaller. And that is something that is important. So, certainly, who wants to have a seedling trying to compete that can't have the ability to compete? So, do address your phosphate, that soil test or application. If you haven't done a soil test, just presume you're going to put fertility. I don't like putting more than 25, 30 pounds with a seed, but I know I need more of phosphate than that. So that's where we talk banding. You'll see different studies in different places. If you're in Saskatchewan, you don't see anything mentioned about potassium, but what do you think they sell Alberta? Potassium fertilizer. So the parent soils are really good. Sulfur. If you're in gray wooded or other areas, high protein crops. And I just had a nice discussion with one of the panelists today, Garfield. And the fact is, sulfur is very important for protein. So if we want good quality, sulfur needs to be considered also in that picture. When it comes to species selection, it's always your objectives, not somebody else's. So what are your objectives for it? Then what are your limitations probably for it? And those conditions are what you're kind of putting your little story together, storyboard, as you're going through it. And then the one thing I've found at times, well, hold on, now people are using round bale silage where they didn't feel it was an option. Now maybe we have some forages like the clovers more available for a hay stand because they're not problematic in drying. So changeable factors, those certainly are some of them. And your preferences, the sheep's preferences, what do they like? And beyond just species, the variety. So you put together a candidates list. So you've got this kind of pulled together, and this whole presentation that I'm talking and presenting on, Ashley is going to give to you. So you're going to have it. You can, if you wish to, I always encourage people grab your phone. I do this, take pictures of the screens, but you're going to have this presentation anyway. But if you wish to do that, that way you can listen. And if I cover things a little too fast, you maybe will catch things where you wouldn't otherwise. But putting that candidates list together and then collecting more information if you feel you need. The other thing I throw into the mix and we'll deal with a little more specifically is the seed certificate for the seed and the price, because certainly there are both of those things to look at to determine if you want to buy it and from that company or not. One of the products that got put together by Alberta beef producers for Western Canada was Forage UPIC. And I worked quite a bit on this back in my Alberta agriculture days and contributed. In the end, I guess I found it a little more limiting than I like. I caution you to say, do not put much in ways of limits in this. Put in a little bit and then check to see what's coming up. Because I found when I put in too many things, nothing came up. And yet I know that one producer would tell me it worked fine, maybe where another one would say it didn't. And some of that is very specific to that management or the location of land. Maybe you are in an area that gets more moisture than your neighbor 10 miles away. And myself, we're on a ridge, and I know that the water and rainfall will often stop before it gets to our place. So use this tool, use it carefully. The Alberta Forage Manual is online. You can get it free. The thing that I look at with it, and it's not, it's something that it's got a lot of content to it, too much. But if you want to find something, it had a lot of good work put into it by two of my mentors, people with 35 years experience as they wrote this, more than I even have now, Arvid Austin and Myron Bjorgi. And this is well respected across Canada and North America for the content in it. Remember, it was written a few years ago, so there are some changes that you're going to look at, and you're going to say, oh, there is an acidic alfalfa. Oh, there is an alfalfa that grows in very moist conditions. Or there is a sainfoin that regrows quite well. So those are things to keep in the back of your mind. Times change, and this manual is still a terrific resource. I like this site that the Peace River Forage Seed Association has. The reason why is I can play on it after I've looked at things and go ahead and, in fact, determine what's in my mix or a mix I build. And in so doing, if you've got the forage manual and you've got this after the forage you pick, you can play around more if you want to. If you're that kind of a person that's an analyzer and want to determine what they've got, this is a very good tool. The thing about species to me, and I put this in red because it is so hard to manage with the wrong species. You have to be good, really good. And that's why I do like having the right species there. So I don't know if it's only worth that. But we know so many people will say no forage grows if it doesn't rain. Or we've heard comments with stockpiled forage. Who has it anyway? Well, those are decisions. And the rainfall is a decision you can't make. But it also is a decision that fertility might improve water usage. It's also a case where legumes with grasses will lift water for grasses. During the night, they lift. During the heat of the day, my apology, they lift. And then the daytime, they drop. Or at nighttime, they drop it. So you've got a situation where there is more management and things than we see. When we look at the province, people will say, which soil zone are you in? And yes, that's true. That's important. But remembering that our lands that we've got forages on now are more marginal than they've ever been, especially with $19 canola, $6.10 barley pre-priced for 2022. Remember that the land in forages can often be very varied. And with that, when you start putting together forage species for it, you have to decide in my own mind, I don't want to have a water course with nothing really growing in it. I'd rather instead target it and plant. Maybe I choose to plant a reed canary grass in it. I don't maybe like it for hay, but I realize it and the clovers will grow and they'll be part of that growth in a way in which I've got harvested material I can use across that landscape and use every acre for the worth it is. And so the different forage species fit in different places. You decide how much, if it's a pasture or a hay stand, how you're going to do things. At times you can do it and separate it. The big thing we're finding now as we look is there's more above ground and below ground decision making than we've ever thought. And a lot of that comes down to some of the soil biology. When we see these different plants with different root systems, fibrous close to the ground, to the soil surface roots, or tap roots that come down quite a bit deeper, what we're trying to do with all of that is look at it as tools. Which tools do we want to use in our system? Which could fit? And in certain cases, we can find some synergy in the combination. Let them compete in a synergistic way versus an antagonistic way where the roots are all in the same zone. Let's put them in more than one zone. This whole soil health thing, this kick, as we call it, that is valid. The reality of it is there is so much going on that can be used to our advantage. And if we do understand it, it can be to our benefit with money in our pocket and better and healthier landscapes to be more stable and produce more solid yields from year to year. So there is importance in below ground. This simple diagram, it reflects the real truth that it's photosynthetic energy through a green solar panel being sent down into roots and into shoots, from root shoots to roots to exudates. 40% of exudates are what come out of the majority of plants. And typically, these organisms function below the root zone if the soil isn't waterlogged, if it isn't compacted, 40 to 60 centimeters. So remember, you can target more soil, target more land below ground than a plant even does if it's working for you. And that's where the plant side comes in. So we're back to looking at these differences and realizing they all come together. And as they come together, some of that decision making coming together in thoughts of what I want to use, and realizing that we're finding if they're well thought out multifunctional groups, they are synergistic. And the ecology of the system starts functioning for you in a way that supports the stand, the stability of the stand during dry years, wetter years, and in my way of thinking, puts the risk management more in your hands. And I guess I'd rather have it in my hands than somebody else's. And then I do my homework and learn and do the best I can to manage it. And that's where the management comes into all of this. So I may be traveling a little bit fast, but as I said, these are all points that are going to be given to you afterwards to refresh. And I want to hit the high points, so that's what you take home. Plant species diversity. I'm selfish. I want that nutrient cycling. I want the urine and manure, if it's a grazed situation, come back on the landscape. And if it's a situation with nitrogen harvesting by legumes from the air, I want them to share it with the grasses. And I know that I'm going to have an additive feature. And I forgot to fix this, Ashley, so sorry about that. The fact is that the diversity needs to be thought through. You have to have yield. You have to have profit. That is something to never lose sight of. And thereafter, you start adding to the structure and to the thought pattern. And that primary production is paramount. But at the same time, we can have our cake and eat it too if we consider building something that's strong. We realize that we're going to have, as we showed earlier, that diversity across the landscapes. And at times, I've got people that'll come up to me and say, I've got a lot of bare spots on my land. What can I do about it? And it might have been because of the cover crop swaths. It could be because the plant species don't creep and fill those areas. Maybe that's important to you. Otherwise, maybe it means there's more productivity from every grass that grows as a hay when it doesn't have to compete with something right beside it. So that's an advantage of a Timothy alfalfa stand, for instance. But the nutrient capture, it's sunlight nutrients as well. So we can't forget that. If you don't, bare soil doesn't capture much nutrients. And at the same time, it even heats up the plants. It's like a the old joke, cat on a hot tin roof. Well, we know that bare soil reflects heat. So we've got hot plants hotter than air temperature, even with bare soil being part of it. So we're managing something that gives us those species together for that variable weather when it's a hot, dry year, which we hope we don't get this year, but a stand that's going to catch, capture, infiltrate, and release water. And if we're going to be grazing late, haying early, whatever we're doing, considerations of all those things in your system for yourself. So that plant species diversity fits there. The one point that was profound to me was Dr. Christine Jones' presentation at, in fact, a Western Canadian grazing conference, and now it's soil health and grazing we always combine because of the importance. I always thought soil grew plants. And what she said was profound when she said, think about it. You've got the soil parent material, the landscape that built that soil situation. However, the flow of carbon down from photosynthesis is the plant's job. The organisms that get fed in the soil get fed from the plant's food. And that's why you're seeing so many people looking at the longer green season of growth on stands. And in May, when Graham Finn speaks to you, he'll be speaking more on that. But the reality is plants grow soil. So let's pick our plants so they grow soils wisely. Don't, you're the one that has the end use. We know, as I was talking to the sheep people at times, I know sheep are fussy. So if they're not going to eat coarse material, if it's a hay, I've got to pick my species. I've got to time my management of that species harvest in a way in which it's going to work well for them. If it's a pasture, I'm picking low growing grasses or grasses that have multi-height growing points so they regrow more quickly. With a sheep, in the way that a ewe can grab and with her lips move around, split lip, she has an ability to pull material from very close to the ground surface. Soil types. And as one of our conversations we had today, I know that pH can vary across landscapes. And as I move into the West Country, where it had parent material of jack pine, willow, aspen, all that probably, all that plant growth over time caused a different soil to be there. Our pH changes. And so, again, it's another reason why we might have to target species and landscapes differently. Um, Soil moisture during the growing season, picking plants that fit our environment and plants that address that moisture shortfall. One of the big things is we always look to the legumes so often because their ability to grow when moisture is short for grasses. And that's where they get that green growth in the August season from the legume. Species adaptation, certainly depending on where you are in this province with your flock, you're looking at a lifespan of forages that maybe is one that has to have extreme hardiness to be that. Maybe it's under irrigation in another place and it's hot. Maybe it's got disease issues based on that climatic condition. And with that in mind, then you come down to the seed and you're looking at purchasing it with a consideration of beyond species now to which lot of seed, which variety is best adapted to this landscape. And at times we'll hear comments that this one doesn't regrow. And then we find that a newer cultivar does regrow pretty well. And that seed persistence of species is something really important to me because as I look at the landscape, do I plan to keep that hay stand down for 7 years, 10 years? Do I plan to keep that pasture in place for a long time too? So with the hay stand, I always turn it towards it's a more easy one, it seems to me, but I think that we could have quite a few years and more options. If we're looking at 3 years down, we've got some really good regrowth alfalfas that can do very well. And in areas where you can get 3 cuts, 4 cuts, then you've got that advantage. And then when we have areas when somebody will say, well, we don't get 3 or 4 cuts, then why are you picking that variety knowing its limitation probably is its hardiness. So again, the harvesting method, as I shared a little earlier, I was doing some work in BC and now all the round bale silage being done, the low pH of the soil, they've got clovers now working very well for them for silage where they were fighting it for hay. And we know that sheep don't care for poor quality hay, but now with round bale silage of clovers, it can be beautiful hay. And orchard grass, knowing that it regrows as well as it does, maybe it's not a problem anymore because I don't have hay laying out for 2 weeks fighting the rains to try to get it up. And again, we're putting in the grazing side. That might be the end of a hay stand's life in what you're planning. I do challenge you a bit with that because usually there's a reason why we take it out of hay. It's not productive. Do we really want a pasture that's not productive? And that's largely what we get. When I look at pasture mixes, I always want a creeping grass in there. I need it for the sake of the carpet on the soil in high clay soils. When those little sheep hooves can pound that soil if it's wet and such, I have carpet to buffer that. I also have plants close to the soil surface to be part of that water infiltration system, allowing for a raindrop to hit a plant leaf to fall off of that to the soil and fall into the soil more easily. I want regrowth. And with that in mind, I'm looking at what I can get. And typically, you're looking at the orchard grasses, the meadow brooms, and we'll talk a bit about that, or the tall fescue, maybe. Those ones are really good at coming fast because the first two have multi height growing points. The latter one being tall fescue or even with creeping red fescue, they got low growing points. So they're not below ground growing points like a smooth brome or a timothy, they're lower. So they regrow faster. I look at the legume in a pasture. I defy you not to have a legume in a pasture. And if many of you know me with my work with Alberta Agriculture and all the forage and applied research associations, we did a lot of work heading there. And to be honest, Canada had done more work going there. The Agri Profits program with Alberta Agriculture showed that legume grass pastures were more profitable and productive. So I want a legume there for the strength of what it brings in attributes. And with that in mind, I've got not just bloating legumes anymore, like people think. I concerned about bloat, take advantage of some of the legumes that don't bloat. And then you can even put some that do. The root variation in pastures is important because that whole life of the stand, the fibrous root of a bunch grass, the rhizomatous root of creeping grass coming together, the deep roots of a reed canary grass, maybe, or a smooth brome versus the shallow roots of a timothy, how do they all fit together? Growth timing. Getting growth early in the spring, well, meadow brome does a really good job of that. Orchard grass, if healthy, will. Tall fescue doesn't as much. So, okay, creeping red fescue, not as early in the spring. Well, if I've got a place where I want to put ewes out early, maybe I put in Kentucky bluegrass because it is early and more similar to creeping red fescue. For hay, alfalfa is the big one. We've always known that. And as it's so predominant in use, that rapid regrowth it provides, the multifoliate nature. To be honest with you, I'm not so excited about this as so many are, nor maybe about that, because so much of us in the province don't have those advantages. Multifoliate traits are showcased in the fourth cut most, in the third cut next most, and some minor in the second cut. So the idea that it's a reason for buying it is a tool, but I want hardiness that comes with it because for many parts of our province that don't get third or fourth cuts, quality to me comes from cutting timing. And now with round bale silage and such, if I can go out there and cut it earlier and do so, I can get the quality I need. I've got a hardy alfalfa that will regrow if cut earlier. That June 21st date you're kind of looking at. You'll want to get out there early so that you got a lot of season in front of you. So if it is the end of June or if it is the 1st of July or when it is, the point of that is still in the back of your mind, managing for maturity of the alfalfa is key. We have a number of plants available to us. And Garfield, here's our yellow alfalfa we're talking about today on a call. The fact is, we're looking at the opportunities some of these can provide. Uh, the hardiness that's extreme with a yellow head, the non bloat, the organic bloat control of tannins. How many of us knew that? Tannins in bird's-ear trefoil, sandfoin, purple prairie clover. All of them are also positive for affecting the parasite load of sheep. So tannins affect the parasites in the sheep, and there are some articles on it you can draw on. So a great organic pest control, an organic bloat control to strongly consider. My apologies. I hope somebody grabbed that. Thank you. Now we've got our clovers. An L-cycle only lives for about 5 years, but those of us in the West Country know it regrows and regrows. Red clover only lasts 2 to 3 years. The big thing I find with these, depending on systems and management, we have opportunities for seed set. And I passed over this, and Sicer milk vetch is non-bloating. It doesn't have tannins. It's rhizomatous. It does very well in pasture. Strongly should be considered. The fact that I want to say this is that it doesn't help the seed business or seed sales, but sandfoin's indeterminate. It sets seed very readily. bird's foot trefoil sets seed very readily. Sicer milk vetch sets seed very.
Hi, everyone. We're just getting Grant set up because we lost him there. I'm not sure if everyone didn't hear him or not, but he's just going to switch his systems and come back.
Can you hear me now, Ashley?
Yes, I can hear you now.
Can you hear me now at all?
Yes, I can hear you. Can everybody else on the webinar hear him? If you could give me a thumbs up if you're on camera. Perfect.
Can you hear me now, Ashley?
Yes.
Sorry about this, everybody. I don't know if it's going to do this again. So we're back?
Yes. If you want, you can go
Okay.
back into your presentation mode. There you go.
All right. All I wanted to say is there's a real opportunity to keep these species for the sake of the anthelmintic properties, the parasite addressing properties that can come. If these are allowed for, maybe it is a mature hay that you keep for the rams, I don't know, but an opportunity to let it get more mature. So it is flowering in the top and it will be setting seeds. So the idea is we're trying to have our cake and eat it too here. Both these species are and need to be managed with more residual left. But they're depending on where you are in this province. I know that there are people that greatly like birds for trefoil, greatly like sandfoin for properties they bring. Anyway, the key grasses for the dry areas are in fact broken down to hay first. And when I look at hay, I look at these grasses that are more typically um, I guess, tolerant to lack of moisture. And of course, it's more challenging to make that good hay with them. When I look at the grasses for grazing, these are the three that come up a lot in the dry areas to consider. When I look at the grasses for the wet areas, we're back to some of the same. Smooth brome actually does, as we know, and most, I think everybody on the call knows that. Timothy is one that manages well in waterlogged soils. Reed canary grass can stand a lot of water, and depending on how dry the land is to get out there to get on it with a machine, it can be very high quality when it's not mature. I look at dual purpose orchard grass and tall fescues for what they bring to the picture, knowing that they themselves are high leaf areas and can be very high quality haze. And again, I'm back down to the meadow brome. This time we're looking at the two species that cover the ground so well and themselves protect it. I always say don't put a lot in. Maybe you have to concentrate on more meadow brome or orchard grass or tall fescue, but a little bit of these guys. And if it is one of those areas, if you're lambing in April, uh, miss the Easter market, I guess. But with that thought in mind, or May, then you can look at that opportunity for it to be on the landscape. The thing about seed companies mixes, I guess, always look at them and say to yourself, now, what is here that I like and what I don't like? There are some mixes that companies will have with an annual in it. And I'll have people call me in and say, I'm looking to put a cover crop in. What do you think about it? And I'll look at their seed mix and they got Italian ryegrass in it. Well, if it's annual ryegrass, Italian perennial ryegrass, all of those are really annuals. You got your cover crop in the seed mix already. So have a look at that. And again, look at the seed that's present. Timothy, if it's in a mix at all, can be a lot. 1 pound of Timothy is in the range of about 25 seeds per square foot. So lots of seeds. So you don't want to have too much of it. And if it is in a mix, be careful how you buy it. I do look at the hardiness and the change of cultivars and mixes. So I ask, what's in which tall fescue is that? Which orchard grass is it? And that's what I'm looking for. Percentages of each. And that's why I directed you to that Peace River Forage seeding calculator. It'll help you here, and I'll help you in a second with this too. But the fact of the matter is that the weight is written on the bags. So if it is 50% of one thing and 50% another, that's 55-pound bag. That's 22 and a half pounds each. It doesn't tell you seed counts of each because seeds sizes differ. And that means you're actually not getting 50-50. I can check for weed seed content. I can do that even if the company's selling it, they'll give it to me with a seed certificate. You do want to know that. And coated or uncoated seed, the more we're dealing with varied landscapes that are seeded into forage ground, that are forage ground, the more we're running into areas that anything that can have a coating on it is going to absorb water, hold it for the seed, bring it to the seed is important to consider. What I wanted to put up here is this is a seed certificate and it tells you, oh, there's 0% in 25 grams, total other crops less than 1%. What it's really saying, brassica species 0 per. But the fact is we know that it's a very clean forage. It would have a listing here. And remember, common number 2 is just like it sounds. It is got way too much of things you don't want in it. Common number one can actually be quite clean. But so people will say, but you do get tolerances for noxious weed seeds even in certified number one. There is tolerances in certified number two for chamomile, oxeye daisy, white cockle. So you don't want those. This is my mixing calculation. When you go to the forage manual on page 160 to 161, you will find this thinking. So if you wanted a stand that was 50% of each, and I'll presume you're British people that enjoy your British numbers, alfalfa, it states in the page 160, 8 pounds is a pure stand of alfalfa. So if I want 50% of a pure stand, that's 4. Now they says meadow brome is 14% is a pure stand. Well, if I want 50% of 14, that's 7. So you can determine your own seeding mixture. I want 11 pounds of this mixture. I'm going to be happy. I don't have to buy more. I don't have to buy less. I have the right seed amount with this. So you can take a pure stand seeding rate and multiply it by a percentage, and it is all in that forage manual on those pages to do your own seeding thinking mix and figure out what you want or check up on a mix you're buying. We talked about this. Remember, anything to do with establishment, we'll get into the species between species competition. Stands are going to evolve. They're not going to be the same. And if they're not the same as what you started with, what are they going to be? So be careful with your picking. This is where we see in alfalfas that natural stand thinning that so often happens in alfalfa mixtures you bought. You find that the dairyman's alfalfa leaves after 3 years, and there you are with your flock, and you've got maybe 1/3 or 1/2 of the stand missing. Not good. And that's where you see so many dandelions. Pasture naturalization. This is just it ebbing and flowing, evolving over the landscape based on the weather, your management, the fertility on it. So that's why we talk about management and fertility next. The reality is that the stands will evolve and change. And as they do so, you're getting what you're putting into it. If you're not happy, maybe that's where we want to understand more. The fact that species that the, the sheep dislike the most, for example, meadow foxtail, which is going to take over that stand? Which grows fastest and earliest in the spring? Meadow foxtail. So lo and behold, what do you have? Something that all your ewes don't want. And law of the most limiting. If you're really short on fertility and it's sulfur in the gray wooded soils, you're going to find the legumes are going to falter back. So it's often legumes, and at times it is, and this is where I look at the fertilizer side of what's in a ton of hay, depending on quality. But what I wanted to show you is how fertilizer can manipulate. If I put 50 pounds of nitrogen, all of a sudden, which was a higher legume stand, now becomes a higher grass stand. If I go and put more phosphorus when it was deficient, all of a sudden my alfalfa's back and I'm thrilled. Again, remember, it's part of fertilizer to manipulate, to manage your way through things. And even in broadleaf grass versus narrow fine leaf grass, if I put nitrogen and phosphorus on a grass hay stand or pasture, I will always have more of the broadleaf grasses coming back. If I put simply nitrogen, I am going to keep the stand like this and increase the yield. So you can manipulate your stands. Now, I know I'm going fast and I apologize for missing you in the middle there, but we can answer questions. There aren't many of you on the call. So with that in mind at the end too. But your seeding rate should be in a manner that tells you I've got the plants I want to compete with the weeds. I've got a stand that I know I'm going to be happy with potentially for many years. because I've put enough of the right ones, not overloaded one versus another, because that would change. The thing that disappointed me so greatly, and this is where I'm going with the talk, is that we don't see the seeds coming they should in a perennial forage stand. Why is that? Why do only 30 to 40% of seeds actually come? The point is, if you do it right, 80% will come. So why do 40% only produce a viable seedling when 80 could? We have seedling losses from poor seed to soil contact, limited food reserves for slow growth. The soil dries out before the root reaches moisture. Seeding too deep. I think the story here is the seed bed, because the reality is, I don't think in all the years of checking forage stands that were disappointing, 98% of the time, the seed bed was not good. The stand, and I defy you almost to seed shallow if the seed bed's soft. Myron Bjorgi said to me so long ago, and I didn't even catch it, but what he said was that seed bed needs to be so firm. And I thought at seeding time, but Myron didn't mean that. He meant before. If it's an annual crop stubble, that's before. If it's chemical fallow, that's before. Summer fallow unworked, that's before. I can't correct, and this is one thing he did say to me. He said, more seed grant does not make up for doing it wrong. And that is an important thing to consider. So seedbed preparation, be it the stubble and in the dry areas of eastern Alberta, the stubble is very important to help with some of the wind speed. The companion crop, where it fits or doesn't fit, is all part of that. If it's in the stand to protect the seedlings from the heat of the sun, from needing a windbreak closer to the soil surface so it isn't blowing and soil moving, with a seed trying to establish, keep it low. So Myron, this is Myron's car and out there. See how firm that seed bed is Myron's got? And the thing about it is, look at where it runs out of moisture. Somebody's saying, well, it ran out of moisture. Well, nothing will grow if it doesn't rain. Look at how the moisture came to the surface for a little seed when it was so well packed. That little seed could suck and pull moisture to itself. But if it's too soft, it's sucking air and it won't be pulling water to itself. And you'll see that seed, you'll see that plant all of a sudden start to die. And if you're watching, so seed it shallow, be confident of it, get out there and get nitty picky. And if you've got a coated seed, it's easier to see how deep it actually is in the soil. So you're trying to determine and find it. These small seeds need to be seeded shallow, more shallow in clay soils than sandy soils. But the reality is, when you look at this, I'll single out alfalfa here. If I seeded at 5/8 of an inch, 64% of the plants came. I don't have lighter, but if I seeded at a quarter to a half, it would have been up to 75, probably. The point is, with all of this, you can see seeding over an inch deep is throwing your money away in a lot of cases. Certainly, it is spending a lot of money on seeds that aren't going to work for you. So we do need shallow seeding, and measuring shallow seeding. These were, when you look at Ken Clark from the University of Manitoba, you know, he measured it carefully with a ruler. I measure it with my fat fingers. And so what is an inch? So be very careful. Cover crop, this is where we're looking at that lesser seeding rate, the nitrogen being low, so that the seedlings established a cover crop's not so competitive, using all the water in its growth stage, and then get out there and harvest it early. Don't wait for the, well, it's not in the soft dough stage yet. That's the beauty of silage versus green feed and other things. But we're harvesting early, getting the cover crop off, and we can do all this. But if we're in eastern Alberta or in dry conditions, 2 weeks of very dry and the oats or barley taking all the moisture might be all you need to kill it. We know that when we're managing stands, that there are disadvantages to all have your cake and eat it too doesn't happen. And what I wanted to show here is that 4 years after, with no fertilizer and no cover crop seeded, this stand was about a third better than the one was seeded with a cover crop. And this came from the West Central Forage Association report in 2000. For those of you from Edson or Entwistle or out towards Piers or Edson, that's your group out there. But the fact is, it lives as a legacy. I've just got a couple more. All I'm going to say with weed control is watch for them. It is important. If you seed no cover crop, you will have so many weeds coming, you'll think, why did I ever do this? But if you were to go out there and mow it when it's 8 inches high to 4 inches and get out of there, if you were to take it for a quick chop silage, round bale silage, or use a herbicide if you can, the point of all that is these are annual weeds so often they're pushed back. Now you've got the little seedlings coming again. You cannot let this lodge, you cannot let this take the sunlight out. Taking the sunlight away from little seedlings by weeds or cover crops are just like taking your tractor or truck and running it without oil in the engine. If the rad hose breaks, if they're short of water, they can live for a little while, just like a vehicle, till it starts to overheat. But if it doesn't have sunlight, it dies very, very quickly. And remember that if you can get them established, they can really be competitive with weeds, as we saw in the other example. So now I'm to the last slide. I think the thing is following principles to build a sound recipe. The biggest thing to me is almost even before what I pick is to make sure I've got that best seed bed, because I've seen so many failures with this. And seed companies are trying to set you up for success. It's not like they're not. But when I hear that it's a bad bunch of seed, but it caught by the trees and on every hill, but not in the valleys. I know that I myself get caught setting a seed drill, setting a seeding system close to the road, on the packed ground, on headlands so often. But the minute I go down off that hill into the valley, I know it's softer. And again, uh, it does pay to get good seed. I agree. There is some science behind it. So if you're going to do everything right, then make sure your seed is there too. Your legumes, of course, their ability to fix nitrogen, crucially important as they add that to the whole grass system. 40% exudates, remember we said at the start, those legumes cheat. They help the grasses compete against them even. So remember, take care of your legumes and they'll take care of the grasses in you. And I made that point firmly. The proper seeding rate, any method will work. If you've got a good seed bed, and on top of that, you're using a proper seeding rate. If you're broadcasting, I do say to people so often, you might have to, beyond harrow packing, you might have to even roll it. And I don't recommend broadcasting in dry years, which this might be one of them, folks, or in eastern Alberta, because I'd certainly have to roll it to get such firmness to bring moisture to the surface. But I also know that no matter what I do, some seed will stay on the surface. And remember, if I hadn't had it firm beforehand, some of that seed will be 2 inches deep. Well, folks, it ain't going to grow. So it didn't work. So firm up a seed bed before you broadcast even. Seeding early in the year is important in my mind because it follows our moisture systems of snow. And as soon as I can get out there with a glyphosate operation, it also helps with the June rains, we hope, into July maybe. We know that it's a lot less likely we're going to get rains in August, but or latter part of July, but it depends. Minimize the competition and monitor it. And this is where I come back in it because it is part of planning, it is part of monitoring, and then controlling. Because the key thing is, I don't want you disappointed next year because your stand didn't catch. But when I ask you, did the seedlings come? And you don't know. Did they come and did they die? Did they come on the hilltops and in the valleys? Monitoring so you know what's going on. And then if it's grasshoppers, maybe you spray for that. And controlling. So maybe you're going to go out there and mow. If you've been monitoring, controlling, and watching and doing all of that in dry conditions, wait. That stand isn't a failure yet. But if it's moist conditions, if you haven't been monitoring, how would you know? And then calling it a failure fast is probably best. Ashley, I'm through and I'm going to pass it back to you. And I know I covered it pretty fast. So I certainly can take any questions and everybody can get this presentation, of course. My apologies for what happened there with the internet. Um, uh, Sorry about that.